Chapter 5 Men from Mars. There was no floating inside the space hotel. The gravity-making machine saw to that. So once the docking had been triumphantly achieved, Mr. Wonka, Charlie, Grandpa Joe, and Mrs. and Mr. Bucket were able to walk out of the break glass elevator into the lobby of the hotel. As for Grandpa George, Grandma Georgina, and Grandma Josephine, none of them had had their feet on the ground for over 20 years, and they certainly weren't going to change their habits now. So when the floating stopped, they all three plopped right back into bed again and insisted that the bed, with them in it, be pushed into the space hotel. Charlie gazed around the huge lobby. On the floor there was a thick green carpet. 20 tremendous chandeliers hung shimmering from the ceiling. The walls were covered with valuable pictures, and there were big soft armchairs all over the place. At the far end of the room, there were the doors of 5 lifts. The group stared in silence at all this luxury. No one dared speak. Mr. Wonka had warned them that every word they uttered would be picked up by space control in Houston, so they had better be careful. A faint humming noise came from somewhere below the floor, but that only made the silence more spooky. Charlie took hold of Grandpa Joe's hand and held it tight. He wasn't sure he liked this much. They had broken into the greatest machine ever built by man, the property of the United States government. And if they were discovered and captured, as they surely must be in the end, what would happen to them? Jail for life? Yes, or something worse. Mr. Wonka was writing on a little pad. He held up the pad. It said, "Anybody hungry?" The 3 old ones in the bed began waving their arms and nodding and opening and shutting their mouths. Mr. Wonka turned the paper over. On the other side, it said, "The kitchens of this hotel are loaded with luxurious food, lobsters, steaks, ice cream. We shall have a feast to end all feasts." Suddenly, a tremendous booming voice came out of a loudspeaker hidden somewhere in the room. "Attention!" boomed the voice, and Charlie jumped. So did Grandpa Joe. Everybody jumped, even Mr. Wonka. "Attention, the 8 Forging astronauts. This is Space Hotel in Houston, Texas, USA. You are trespassing on American property. You are ordered to identify yourselves immediately. Speak now." "Shh," whispered Mr. Wonka, finger to lips. There followed a few seconds of awful silence. Nobody moved except Mr. Wonka, who kept saying, "Shh, shh." "Who are you?" boomed the voice from Houston, and the whole world heard it. "I repeat, who are you?" shouted the angry, urgent voice, and 500 million people crouched in front of their television sets, waiting for an answer to come from the mysterious strangers inside the space hotel. The television was not able to show a picture of these mysterious strangers. There was no camera in it to record the scene. Only the words came through. The TV watchers saw nothing but the outside of the giant hotel in orbit, photographed, of course, by Shucksworth, Shanks, and Shower, who were following behind. For half a minute, the world waited for a reply, but no reply came. "Speak!" boomed the voice, getting louder and louder, and ending in a fearful, frightening shout that rattled Charlie's eardrums. "Speak! Speak! Speak!" Grandma Georgina shot under the sheet. Grandma Josephine stuck her fingers in her ears. Grandpa George buried his head in the pillow. Mr. and Mrs. Bucket, both petrified, were once again in each other's arms. Charlie was clutching Grandpa Joe's hand, and the 2 of them were staring at Mr. Wonka and begging him with their eyes to do something. Mr. Wonka stood very still, and although his face looked calm, you can be quite sure his clever and sensitive brain was spinning like a dynamo. "This is your last chance," boomed the voice. "We are asking you once more, who are you? Reply immediately. If you do not reply, we shall be forced to regard you as dangerous enemies. We shall then press the emergency freezer switch, and the temperature in the Space Hotel will drop to minus 100 degrees centigrade. All of you will be instantly deep frozen. You will have 15 seconds to speak. After that, you are turned to icicles. 1, 2, 3. Grandpa, whispered Charlie as the counting continued, "we must do something. We must. Quick!" 6, said the voice. 7, 8, 9. Mr. Wonka had not moved. He was still gazing straight ahead, still quite cool, perfectly expressionless. Charlie and Grandpa Joe were staring at him in horror. Then, all at once, they saw the tiny twinkling wrinkles of a smile appear around the corners of his eyes. He sprang to life. He spun around on his toes, skipped a few paces across the floor, and then, in a freezed, unearthly sort of scream, he cried, "Thimble Fez!" The loudspeaker stopped counting. There was silence. All over the world, there was silence. Charlie's eyes were riveted on Mr. Wonka. He was going to speak again. He was taking a deep breath. "Bungo Buha!" he screamed. He put so much force into his voice that the effort lifted him right up onto the tip of his toes. "Bungo Bummy Dafu Dunny Yubi Lunny." Again the silence. The next time Mr. Wonka spoke, the words came out so fast and sharp and loud they were like bullets from a machine gun. "Song, song, 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 song," he barked. The noise echoed around and around the lobby of the Space Hotel. It echoed around the world. Mr. Wonka now turned and faced the far end of the lobby where the loudspeaker voice had come from. He walked a few paces forward as a man would, perhaps, hold a more intimate conversation with his audience. And this time, the tone was much quieter. The words came more slowly, but there was a touch of steel in every syllable. "Quacksuki, Matabuki, Weebies, Wizzy, Yubi Cuckoo. Alapanda, Kaka, Manda, Pantine, Fodlodon, if no suspenda. Finicky Dakia, Weebi Stronga, Yubi Wika. Fofo Kota, Bohu Monka, Fahir Risky, Uprovoca. Pat Moon Stars, Fan is and it's Mars. Mr. Wonka paused dramatically for a few seconds. Then he took an enormous deep breath, and in a wild and fearsome voice, he yelled out, "Kitty Beebing Zong, Fimji Lazy Juve, Google Miza Juvie, Fami Kaka Zunk, Anna Polala Zong Zong Zong." The effect of all this on the world below was electric. In the control room in Houston, in the White House in Washington, in palaces and city buildings and mountain shacks from Africa to China to Peru, the 500 million people who heard that wild and fearsome voice yelling out these strange and mystic words all shivered with fear before their television sets. Everybody began turning to everybody else and saying, "Who are they? What language was that? Where did they come from?" In the president's study in the White House, Vice President Tibbs, the members of the cabinet, the chiefs of the Army and the Navy and the Air Force, the sorcerer from Afghanistan, the chief financial advisor, and Mrs. Tabby Puss the cat, all stood tense and rigid. They were very much afraid, but the president himself kept a cool head and a clear brain. "Nanny!" he cried. "Oh, Nanny, what on earth do we do now?" "I'll get you a nice warm glass of milk," said Miss Tibbs. "I hate that stuff," said the president. "Please don't make me drink it." "Summon the chief interpreter," said Miss Tibbs. "Summon the chief interpreter," said the president. "Where is he?" "Right here, Mr. President," said the chief interpreter. "What language was that creature sprouting up there in the Space Hotel? Be quick. Was it Eskimo?" "No Eskimo, Mr. President." "Aha! That was Tagalog. A Tagalog or Yugo." "Not Tagalog, Mr. President. Not Yugo either." "Was it Tutu then? Or Tongass or Tupi?" "Definitely not Tutu, Mr. President. And I'm quite sure it wasn't Tongass or Tupi." "Don't stand there telling him that it wasn't, you idiot," said Miss Tibbs. "Tell him what it was, V." "Yes, ma'am, Miss Vice President, ma'am," said the chief interpreter, began to shake. "Believe me, Mr. President," he went on, "it was not a language I have ever heard before." "But I thought you knew every language in the world." "I do, Mr. President." "Don't lie to me, chief interpreter. How can you possibly know every language in the world when you don't know this one?" "It is not a language of this world, Mr. President." "Nonsense, ma'am," barked Miss Tibbs. "I understood some of it myself." "These people, Miss Vice President, ma'am, have obviously tried to learn just a few of our easier words, but the rest of it is a language that has never been heard before on this earth." "Screaming scorpions!" cried the president. "You mean to tell me they could be coming from somewhere else?" "Precisely, Mr. President." "Like where?" said the president. "Who knows?" said the chief interpreter. "Did you not notice, Mr. President, how they use the words Venus and Mars?" "Of course I noticed," said the president. "But what that's got to do with it?" "Aha! I see where you're driving at. Good gracious me! Men from Mars!" "And Venus," said the chief interpreter. "That," said the president, "could make for trouble." "I'll say it could," said the chief interpreter. "He wasn't talking to you," said Miss Tibbs. "What do we do now, General?" said the president. "Blow him up," cried the general. "You're always wanting to blow things up," said the president crossly. "Can't you think of something else?" "I like blowing things up," said the general. "It makes such a lovely voice. Rump, rump." "Don't be a fool," said Miss Tibbs. "If you blow these people up, Mars will declare war on us. So will Venus." "Quite right, Nanny," said the president. "We'll be turkulated like turkeys, every one of us. We'll be mashed like potatoes." "I'll take 'em on," shouted the chief of the army. "Shut up," snapped Miss Tibbs. "You're fired." "Hooray!" said all the other generals. "Well done, Miss Vice President, ma'am." Miss Tibbs said, "We've got to treat these fellows gently. The one who spoke just now sounded extremely cross. We've got to be polite to them, butter them up, make them happy. The last thing we want is to be invaded by men from Mars. You got to talk to them, Mr. President. Tell Houston we want another direct radio link with the Space Hotel. And hurry!" Now, moving on. Chapter 6. Invitation to the White House. The President of the United States will now address you, announced the loudspeaker voice in the lobby of the Space Hotel. Grandma Georgina's head peeped cautiously out from under the sheets. Grandma Josephine took her fingers out of her ears, and Grandpa George lifted his face out of the pillow. "You mean he's actually going to speak to us?" whispered Charlie. "Shh," said Mr. Wonka. "Listen." "Dear friends," said the well-known presidential voice over the loudspeaker. Dear friends. Welcome to Space Hotel USA. Greetings to the brave astronauts from Mars and Venus." "Mars and Venus?" whispered Charlie. You mean he thinks we're from... Shh, 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 said Mr. Wonka. He was doubled up with silent laughter, shaking all over and hopping from one foot to the other. You have come a long way, the president continued. So why don't you come just a tiny bit farther and pay us a visit down here on our humble little earth? I invite all 8 of you to stay with me here in Washington as my honored guests. You can land that wonderful glass air machine of yours on the lawn in back of the White House. We shall have the red carpet out and ready. I do hope you know enough of our language to understand me. I shall wait most anxiously for your reply. There was a click, and the president went off the air. What a fantastic thing, Mr. Grandma Jill. The White House, Charlie. We're invited to the White House as honored guests. Charlie caught hold of Grandpa Joe's hands, and the 2 of them started dancing round and round the lobby of the hotel. Mr. Wonka, still shaking with laughter, went and sat down on the bed and signaled everyone to gather around close so they could whisper without being heard by the hidden microphones. You're scared to death, he whispered. He won't bother us anymore now, so let's have the feast that we were talking about, and afterwards we explore the hotel. Aren't we going to the White House? Whispered Grandma Josephine. I want to go to the White House and stay with the president. My dear old Dotty Dumpling, said Mr. Wonka, you look as much like a man from Mars as a bedbug. They know at once they've been fooled. We'd be arrested before we could say, how do you do? Mr. Wonka was right. There was no question of accepting the president's invitation, and they all knew it. But we've got to say something to him, Charlie whispered. He must be sitting down there in the White House this very minute waiting for an answer. Make an excuse, said Mr. Bucket. Tell him we're otherwise engaged, said Mrs. Bucket. You are right, whispered Mr. Wonka. It is rude to ignore an invitation. He stood up and walked a few paces from the group. For a moment or 2, he remained still, gathering his thoughts. Then once again, Charlie saw those tiny, winkling, smiling wrinkles around the corners of his eyes. And when he began to speak, his voice this time was like the voice of a giant, deep and devilish, very slow and very loud. And the quaggy, goggy Suckamiech, and the marshy, medius harshland, at the witchy hour gloominess of the groves commusing home. You can hear them softly sliming, hissing over the slubber of the oily, boily bodies oozing onward in the gloam. Start to run, oh skid and daddle through the slumber slush and soil. Skip, jump, hop, and try to scattle all the grums around the ROM. In his study 240,000 miles below, the president turned as white as the White House. Jumping jackrabbits, he cried. I think they're after us. Oh, please let me blow them up, said ex-chief of the army. Slide, said Miss Tibbs. Go and stand in the corner. In the lobby of the hotel, Mr. Wonka had merely paused in order to think up another verse, and he was just about to start off again when a frightful, piercing scream stopped him cold. The screamer was Grandma Josephine. She was sitting up in bed and pointing with a shaking finger at lifts at the far end of the lobby. She screamed a second time, still pointing, and all eyes turned towards lifts. The door of the one on the left was slowly sliding open, and the watchers could clearly see there was something thick, something brown, something not exactly brown, but greenish brown, something with slimy skin and large eyes, squatting inside the lift.